I simply think that this could be the critical thing that goes on this planet in the next 10 years, in this decade of the environment. That there is nothing more important than what you are doing here and what you're going to do about and with what you're doing here. So I really do truly once again welcome you with all my heart. And it occurred to me that a part of what we're about is, in the words that I like to use, preventive measures. Does that sort of ring a bell for folks? And if it does, and even if it doesn't, I would like to share a little poem with you about prevention that I've enjoyed for some time and shared with people all over the world. This is the story of the ambulance down in the valley. 'Twas a dangerous cliff, as they freely confessed, though to walk near its edge was quite pleasant, till over the side slipped a duke and a prince, and it had fooled many a peasant. The people all said something had to be done, though their projects did not at all tally. Some said put a fence round the edge of the cliff. Others, an ambulance down in the valley. The lament of the crowd was profound and so loud as their hearts overflowed with great pity. But the ambulance carried the cry of the day as it spread to the neighboring cities. A collection was made to accumulate aid, and dwellers in highway and alley gave dollars and cents, not to furnish a fence, but an ambulance down in the valley. For the cliff is all right if you're careful, they said, and if folks ever tripping or falling, it's not the slipping and sliding that hurts so much as the shock when they're stopping. And so on for years as these mishaps occurred, quick forth would the rescuers sally to pick up the victims who fell from the cliff with the ambulance down in the valley. Said one in his plea, "It's a marvel to me that you give so much greater attention to repairing results than to curing the cause. Why, you'd much better aim at prevention. The mischief, of course, should be stopped at its source. Come, friends and good neighbors, let's rally. It makes far better sense to rely on a fence than an ambulance down in the valley." "He's wrong in his head," the majority said. "He would end all our earnest endeavors. He's the kind of a jerk that would halt our good work, but we will support it forever. Don't we pick up them all just as quick as they fall and treat them with care quite liberally? A superfluous fence is of no consequence if the ambulance works in the valley." Well, the story is queer, as I've given it here, though things oft occur which are stranger. More humane, we assert, to repair all the hurt than the plan of removing the danger. Before it all ends, it's time to begin to attend to these things rationally. Yes, build up the fence and let us dispense with the ambulance down in the valley. Well, thank you very much, and welcome, welcome, welcome. I hope that you have as an enjoyable, wonderful, and interesting time as you've ever had your life here in these Rocky Mountains, and do good work. We need it. I'd like to now introduce the director of the Aspen Institute on Global Change, formerly of WinStar, our dear friend, Mr. John Katzenberger.
Okay, and one more quick warm-up act before Guy. We could have went through these quickly in the morning, or at least referenced them, but these are the questions that were included in the These are the questions that were included in the program and in the guidance for preparation of presentations, and so we thought we'd just throw them up once more, more just to kind of have in our thought as we're moving into the discussions. Some of the, I guess this sort of informs the outcomes that we're hoping for, not only for us personally to take away back into our research and our careers, and not only for AGCI to take away in terms of ideas that inform our future work, but also kind of maybe an order of topics that could, if we can achieve some sort of synthesis by the end of the week, really inform a useful and novel product. And so the first question is focused on your career. How have the research questions and scientific priorities in your work or specific field evolved since you began as a scientist? and how has that evolution of the science brought you to where you are now? And so this is looking at more kind of milestones and mentors and accomplishments and kind of more maybe looking towards the past. And I think that's also, an element of question 2 in terms of what have been the major ways in which global change research has evolved for the better and for the worse. What has enabled progress and what has slowed it? What lessons do you draw for the future? And really focusing on anything from research topics to data to infrastructure to the kind of larger conditions, political otherwise, in which we operate. The third question is on societal needs. How has society's need for information about how is society's need evolving in terms of information for global change? What do you see as the critical role for science in that interface? And are there trade-offs between fundamental science and its application? And if so, how should they be managed effectively? And I guess kind of the first 3 questions really lead to maybe the essence of the topic of this meeting, frontiers of global change science. Where do you see global change science going over the next 10 to 20 years? What new research priorities are emerging? What are the impediments and opportunities that will need to be managed? And thinking about not only each individual field, but the whole enterprise as a whole. And then, of course, particularly of interest to the staff here, the board of advisors, some of which are represented. What is AGCI's role in making that happen? And like we've always operated, we really benefit and find essential input from the community in terms of what we should be doing. And so, like in past sessions where we solicit input on future directions, there'll be opportunities for those inputs here as well. So those are the 5 questions to keep in mind. There'll be more of the explicit focus of the breakout groups on Thursday. There's an opportunity to come to points of consensus as well as acknowledge points of difference on any of these questions during the breakout groups. And that'll help us really as we move towards Friday morning in terms of coming up with the outline of a product that we could collaborate on moving forward. So without further ado, I'll leave you with that and bring up Guy's presentation. And a microphone. Yeah.
Put it back.
Yeah,
better.
right in the middle
Yeah.
works better. If you don't mind. Thank you.
Good. Okay, well, a few days ago, not weeks, days ago, James called me and he said, well, since you're going to be here only for one day, would you mind giving kind of a talk, no title, but perhaps you could be talking about the tension that exists between those who believe that they should do science, independent science, and those who believe that they should really help society and communicate with society. There is a tension there, and there is a tension in the funding, there is a tension sometimes between scientists about that. And so, in order to start my thinking about that, I took the result of a survey that is going on for a meeting that's coming up in September, organized by WCRP, and with the purpose of trying to find out what the science should do after the last IPCC. And so one person responding to this survey said, climate mitigation policy no longer needs a better understanding of climate. That's what a person said. I said, okay, well, let me start from here and see why I'm not really in agreement with this statement. So what I'm going to do is, of course, it is the 25th anniversary of the Institute here, so I'm going to take it a bit as an historical walk through how our science has been evolving and how it is changing now pretty dramatically, or has been changing in the last year dramatically. And so I'm not going to try to give you a course of climate history. I'll leave it to Richard, but take a number of steps to show how things have been evolving. In fact, if we look at the last 50 years, twice the length, I think we shouldn't forget some of the pioneers. And I wanted to put Kealing here because Kealing has not only been a great scientist, he has been a person who has been bringing up a very important problem for society. And in fact, his curve might have been, in the whole history of climate research, the best communication tool that we have ever had. So certainly another and perhaps a most important milestone, and I think John mentioned it also, you will see some of the repeats in some slides, of course, as I go through, is this landmark UN conference on the environment, on the global environment. And if you look at the outcome of this conference, you see a number of important points. Science and technology should be used to improve the environment. So please, scientists, get involved and try to find out how to address the problem that society is facing. Number two, research and education in environmental science should be promoted. Number three, cooperation on international issues should be regarded as essential. That has put some boundary, or at least initial condition, to a number of activities that have been taking place since then. First of all, in 1972, less than a year after this conference, the United Nations Environment Programme was created with a mission of providing leadership and encourage partnership in caring for the environment by inspiring, informing, and enabling nations and people to improve their quality of life without compromising that of future generations. That's a real, I think, high-level mission, and I think we should be inspired by that. Very soon, the science started to become visibility, and already in the 60s and then in the 70s, people like Manabe, see his picture here, came up with the idea of, if you double the concentration of CO2, here's what's going to happen. So suddenly, this doubling of CO2 became another kind of target to be studied, to understand. And in fact, Jeff, when he showed this simple equation, was very much related to this kind of approach that started at that time. But the scientific community got mobilized. And I'm going to try to go through a number of accomplishments of the science. Now, in the 70s, suddenly supercomputers, vector supercomputers, became available. In fact, NCAR got the first real operational supercomputer and allowed a number of people in the scientific community here in the US to do quite a bit of advanced modeling. Satellite data started to transform the field, and global warming was simulated. Now, John showed the simplified Bretherton diagram. I'm taking this one not to show you all the details, but physical climate system, biogeochemical cycles, the two major aspects. The reason I'm showing you this is because just like the Kealing curve was a very good tool for communication, this one is an excellent tool to show what leadership means. Leadership has been crucial in the early development of global change research by a number of people who put the intellectual resources together basically as a background for a huge project like Mission to Planet Earth. And I think Gassam mentioned that earlier also. How many people what community has been starting working around this diagram, which at that time did not include very much of human or social science, but at least put atmospheric scientists with ocean scientists, terrestrial ecosystem people, atmospheric chemists, etc. WCRP was born more or less at that time, and of course put together the scientific community in a very aggressive research mode. IGBP, another international program, launched this case in 1987 to really look at how the biological world, the chemical world, and the physical world interact. And then, of course, the agency started to be clearly understanding, capturing the necessity of the big picture, of the integration, of the interdisciplinarity, and again, we saw that from Gassam earlier. Not only on the progress was made on observation, but of course the modeling generated a lot of activities. Perhaps, you have seen this slide many times, but what I would like to highlight here is that, starting from the Manabi type of work, from individuals to small teams to large team, and to distributed interdisciplinary interagency team in order to move from what we did in the 60s to what we are doing today. So the picture of the science, the way we work, has been evolving. The culture of the research has been evolving dramatically in this period of time. And if you look today, for example, what NCAR is providing as a community model, Earth system model, you see essentially all that kind of flourishing into a very, very broad approach. So again, a lot of accomplishment. Land models were developed. Parametrization to better reproduce what we could not simulate were introduced. Reanalysis, carbon cycle, aerosol chemistry, operational seasonal prediction came up, biogeochemistry coupled with a physical climate system, which basically was what Bretherton was saying to do, and then very high resolution global climate models are integrated. But then as the science made so much progress, the scientists became more and more convinced that communication to society was needed. And you see here the IPCC assessment begin. And in fact, you know all about, of course, all these effort, tremendous effort that has kind of created a large community of scientists who virtually now work for assessment and work for IPCC. But have we really succeeded? And of course, some of you have seen this picture before. This is my Avignon Bridge. This is the Rhone River in France. This is the old Avignon Bridge. The science is here. The scientists want to reach society, public service, private corporation, but they only get to the middle of the river.
It's still not built.
Still, yeah. So what do we need? We need the other half of the bridge. And there is a recognition that I think, I call this IPCC, that this bridge still needs to be built. And this bridge probably, seen users here, needs not to be a continuation of this bridge, but a new bridge that comes and goes towards the existing IPCC. And so as we are doing that, we also realize, as I think Don indicated earlier, that we cannot isolate climate from other stressors that affect our planet. Energy and carbon, water scarcity, food availability, air quality, human health, urbanization and population migration, poverty and education. All these issues need to be taken into account in our thinking, and that requires, of course, understanding interaction and feedbacks, developing integrated regional studies to really try to see how development enters in the picture, find out about the coupling between biophysical and social system, improve, of course, existing climate tools, but also integrated new approaches, priorities, capability, and cooperate with new partners. And this is where we were probably 10 years ago, when suddenly the political world started to open itself to some of these problems. So the time has come, and this is, I believe, how the evolution is taking place now, is really not only to understand the system, but to address global and regional integrated Earth system problems. So how have we tried to do that in the past years or decades? Maybe you don't know that 500 multilateral environmental agreements has been signed in order to try to address the problem. The number here since the Stockholm conference has been increasing. We're here in 2011. The numbers of parties involved has been growing. A bureaucracy, an international bureaucracy has been created. But if the number of agreements is very high, what have been the effect of all these agreements? So we need a scorecard in order to find out how successful we have been. Here's an environmental scorecard. And everything, you see all the problems in the atmosphere, biodiversity, policy program, chemical and waste, land, water, all the problems that society is facing. The green line is where significant progress have been noted. And the red line is where further deterioration has been seen. In fact, there has been some progress. Stratospheric ozone, lead in gasoline are kind of progress. You might find one here perhaps in drinking water, but generally speaking, they are where maybe little or no progress or further deterioration has been there. So the IPCC has not convinced anybody up to now. The 500 multilateral agreement have not really solved the problem. So there is a recognition that key scientific progress has been made, but it has not sufficiently helped society to cope with expected climate change and also climate variation. In particular, society needs to better assess its vulnerability to climate change and to develop mitigation adaptation strategy to increase resilience. And so the idea of vulnerability assessment, the concept of adaptation is now receiving, of course, more attention, and that's the latest trend, I would say, in the last 10 years that needs to be taken into account in the way the Global Change Program has been evolving. And so we're not there just to build the science basis as we have been doing in the past, but we have to account for the other aspect, economy, society, law, and governance, finally to come to the top here where we deal with adaptation and mitigation. How do we construct this building? How do we make it supported so that we can address the problems that are all synthesized here, including solar activity, including all the agreements that are here? How can we make society be beyond a picture that is so complicated? Well, I like to show this graph here, which shows what's called the valley of death. These are the resources available for research, and of course they're not sufficient. These are the resources that are available for operational, and here is kind of the middle place between, let's say, early development and full development, where we have some lack of support in this link between basically research and communication. And one of the difficulty, of course, is that scientists are forced to face communication into value conflicting contest. And again, this is more or less the same graph as what you saw, the scientists in red and the resources, the users on this side. And then, of course, we can ask ourselves, is data, is information generation adequate? Perhaps, probably not. Integration, analysis, and interpretation remains problematic. Delivery, translation for application, including non-climate context, emergence, but still weak. And finally, appropriate informed adoption, relatively mixed. So we have to look at this kind of transition today, because this is where a lot of activity will be taking place. And the difficulty, of course, is that in many cases, it's not a pure rational approach that is needed, but there will be choices to be made that require, of course, more than just numbers and equations. So this is why climate services have been developed, in order to facilitate this transition. And if you look now at what happens internationally, first of all, climate service involve the production, translation, transfer, and use of climate knowledge and information in climate-informed decision-making, climate-smart policy and planning. And so they ensure that the best available climate science is communicated with sectors like agriculture, water, health, and develop and evaluate mitigation and adaptation strategy. And today, you have the Climate Service Partnership, which brings together a lot of climate services that exist in the world, but probably more important in size, the global framework for climate services that WMO and other UN agencies have been putting to help creating this link that I was mentioning between science, between research and society. And here the global framework for climate service includes essentially, it came out of the World Climate Conference 3 in 2009. It includes, of course, a number of activities that already exist and are very active, observation and monitoring through a number of international programs, research, modeling, and prediction. But then you move up here to climate service information system, user interface, user, government, private sector, etc. And what I would like to emphasize is essentially the circle here that labeled capacity development and capacity building. Because I believe personally that at the end, what you will have to do if you want to address the problem is really to provide the capacity development that is largely insufficient. And if one day this institute could work about this issue of capacity development, which has largely failed in the past, in spite of the high investment that we have been putting there, that would be a very interesting thing to do, because we need new methods, new approaches to capacity building. Of course, as we deal with climate change adaptation or disaster risk management, we have to learn today to start, on the one hand, from the climate system aspect, the one that climate organization like NCAR or others are doing, but also look at the economic system and try to bring them together, going through, of course, impact, vulnerability, risk and benefit, economic cost, etc. So this is perhaps the new framework for addressing the problem from both directions. Now, if we look at climate services that are this middleman or this interface, we see basically two approaches today. The top-down approach, where we see the development of large database, dissemination of data, and then we see the bottom-up approach, where the idea is to more initiating a dialogue with stakeholders, identifying their specific needs, etc. And those two approaches are used, and perhaps some tension exists also between the two. This is now what Europe, the European Union, is doing regarding climate service. I don't want to get into detail. It's complicated. Space agencies here, a large project called Copernicus, which will become operational for the atmosphere, for land, for the ocean next year, a strong research project, but also links with citizens, business, institutional group, and of course institutional, international organization. We can see groups that are more bottom-up, where the attempt is to bring together scientific knowledge, the one we're carrying, with local knowledge, for which we know very little, into an attempt to increase resilience or build resilience, understanding vulnerability, and at the end, developing adaptation options. What is very interesting is that you see now the industry that is trying to get interested by this problem. For example, we saw a recent study where Bloomberg, Paulson, the former Secretary of Treasury of Bush, and others called for a study called Risky Business, looking at how climate change could impact their business. What I read, I think it was in Le Monde, in the newspaper, they said, you know, this report is clear because it doesn't talk about temperature change, it doesn't talk about flooding. It talks about the loss that the business will have, about how much unemployment will result of that. Finally, after this fuzzy IPCC document that is confusing, that is long, that has a lot of working group, we have a clear picture of what's happening. And I think this is a lesson for us to see that we have to, you know, those documents might be much more powerful than anything we are producing, not only because of the message that they convey, but because of the messenger. When Paulson or Bloomberg tell industry that they need to do something about climate, probably it's much more powerful than what the IPCC is saying. And so I urge you really to think about that in terms also of doing something in the future. So let me go quickly now to finalize and just indicate that, you know, the fundamental climate science has made tremendous progress, but of course many problems remain to be addressed. the impact, adaptation, vulnerability community becomes more prominent, receive increasing support, and in fact, this also creates some tension between the two communities. And so there is a need to continue doing a lot of fundamental science. These are the 6 major challenges of WCRP. Maybe we should add a few on seasonal to decadal prediction, coupling between climate and biogeochemical cycles. All that is very relevant to society. At this end, I'm going to pass. But at the end, what we really need to do is to see how to decarbonize society, and that is the major challenge that we have. So, and I'm going to conclude with this and one more slide. The missing appeal is to go from climate data, and this is the science, the climate scientific, to information that comes to society. We need this distillery to put that in place so that, and I'm going to pass this, these are a few, well, to really indicate this, that in reality, as we do that, we need to form interdisciplinary group. That's the way by which we will ease the tension that could exist between those two groups. But we have to think a bit about what interdisciplinary mean. And that includes shared concept of language, collaboration by those who excel in their own field, in their own discipline. In fact, there is only good interdisciplinary science if there is underneath good disciplinary science. Joint proposal development, intellectual mutual respect, long-term commitment, good communication, stakeholder participation. Thank you.
So we'll have some time for questions and discussion. I have one more kind of a clarifying question. When you're thinking about capacity building, what types of capacities are you thinking about, and how do they differentiate between capacities that are needed in developing contexts versus developed contexts?
Well, what I believe, and this is why we're creating now something called the Earth Academy, the capacity building has been doing many, many different things, usually with a lot of investment and very little return. Summer schools are good examples where we bring people there for a week. There is no big discrimination between the kind of capacity building we're doing, and the activity is not sustained. And so what I believe is needed today is really to target, this is to respond to your question, to target the future leaders, the people who in 10 years from now will have major responsibility in society. And rather than having to convince them of the importance of, climate or our issue, that they have the understanding and the background so that it's part of their culture, of their belief, in fact, on how to react. So for me, the priority is really to go to not so much to, how to improve the capability of students to do better models or these kind of things, but more to really talk to the people who will be multiplicators, who will either teach or be decision makers, and make sure that just like they learn math, they learn physics, they learn economics, they have a background in planetary questions today. And so I think this is where the capacity building should go. But it can only go through programs that are lasting and not just a summer school of a week, but accompany them in their own development.
What is happening with this, what you're calling your academy? What's developing?
Okay, this is in information now. It's part, it's part a bit of another group that's called here the Earth League. The Earth League is a group of science. Maybe I didn't have time to talk about that, but it's really a group of people who start to. It's a self-organized network of scientific entities, organization with scientists, spending in both hemispheres, working to respond to some of the most pressing issues. So, basically, the first paper that came out after a meeting in Santa Fe is really to call policymakers to take action after IPCC, and so there is a paper submitted to Nature on this. So as part of the Earth League, we're thinking of developing an Earth Academy that will focus a number of potential bright scientists, which we will call fellows, and will during 2 years be part of that network and work with that network to really get some development in their understanding of the problem, work on some project for 2 or 3 years, and then will kind of continue probably to be link of this large network of institutions. So we're trying to put a new system of capacity building to associate people from Africa, from South America, from Asia for a relatively long period of time so that they can start understanding those human, environmental aspects, looking at the impact of the socio-ecological system, societal transformation that are required. This is, we believe, what really needs to be done today.
So Guy, have you looked at, has this group looked at other places in which this is being tried?
Yeah.
In a snapshot, this is more coordinated.
Yeah,
and
this
therefore
is a
needed.
partnership. Oh yeah.
Right.
So
But it has drawn on lessons for things that have been working as well, because we're full of new recommendations around the planet.
so we're trying to do that,
All right.
but we are beginning. We're starting.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's good.
But we don't want to do something that's already exists. We want to link a number of things that exist
Gotcha.
and create this networking across the world.
Yeah, I take your point about risky business and its communicative effectiveness compared to IPCC.
Yeah.
I wanted to comment, by the way, that the National Climate Assessment did a technically sound job and good communication. IPCC may not. But the parts of it, risky business, that I'm good enough to know, and maybe some of you have read it, it's a really shitty piece of analysis.
It's not good analysis.
Yeah,
It isn't.
I mean, so maybe, so let me just say that maybe that, I hope the world doesn't have to work that way, that that poor analysis is more easy to turn into snippets. The adaptation analysis within agriculture sets us back 20 years to the old dumb farmer problem, and risky business is like the dumb economy problem.
Right.
So let's just, they did a good job in communication, but not on analysis. But let's praise IPCC for paying attention to scientific details and nuance.
I think Michael might want to respond.
Well, so I'm going to address this on Wednesday, but I want to make 2 comments. The national assessment doesn't have any monetary outcomes at all. That's a huge difference with risky business. I want to make a proposal for something that would be more systematic and would go and with more organizational heft than risky business. But what I'm going to argue is monetary metrics are not the only ones to be considered. That if you don't address monetary metrics, you can't answer the question, why the hell should I be giving up jobs and spending money to retrofit my factory? What is the benefit relative to the cost? But I'll address that on Wednesday.
Let me make sure that you don't, no one thinks that I'm saying we shouldn't address
No.
Yeah,
labor.
exactly.
I really appreciate where they went on labor and other measures that spoke to people. Yeah.
But they did it on a shoestring without really the information base that's
Yeah.
needed.
That's
And that's the bit that I want to argue is missing.
No, that's good.
That's the next step.
Yeah, I really like your presentation, Guy. I just would like to add that so as it is so important to analyze the weather with some methods and tools and data, so social scientists have already come up with a very good understanding of the reasons or the factors that enable capacities to mitigate and to adapt. And I think that it's important that we consider those when trying to engage in science policy interfaces. Otherwise, we will make mistakes. I mean, in my case, I would never go and do models, weather models or dwarfs or whatever the others do. And the same can be said of many areas of social science research. I mean, there is a lot of good work, very robust work on issues. And I mean, I know we don't have all this necessary social and physical and engineering sciences in this conversation, but let's be very careful and right when we, because one thing is to say, oh yes, out of the blue I decided that we will create a good initiative, and social scientists have shown that academics play a key role in affecting change. That's a good thing to say, but there are many reasons, many constraints, many factors. Jeff referred to some values, power, behavior, legal mandates that explain why is it that authorities or decision makers can go so far with the efforts.
So, Patty, I think what I've been trying to show is that the field of climate science, taking it from my side, which is I'm a physical scientist, has evolved, first of all, into being more integrated and more interdisciplinary. And in the last 5 years or so, 10 years, has really recognized the turn into the need for strong connection with the social science. Now, the social science has its own history and development, and clearly the level of development might be similar, might be very different in certain cases. Mm-hmm. But today we are, I think, at a juncture where essentially, we need to go into joint proposal. We need to recognize that people have been succeeding in their own field. We need mutual respects, and that's how we're going to reduce the tension that exists. And I think a place like this institute here has been playing a major role, of course at a limited level worldwide, but still with leaders to go and move into that direction. So in fact, we are at the beginning of a new era, and we have now to build this connection with the two different sciences. Very few places co-locate social scientists and natural scientists in the same group. Very few people understand exactly how to work. It's amazing when you hear still some of the remarks that are made today by some people, how far the two communities are. So they need to be a cultural revolution, and the valley of death or whatever needs to be filled up. That's where we are today, I think.
No, and I agree with that. I mean, again, I think that there we are on the same page. It was just about the question on capacity. I mean, capacity has been studied by social scientists and as a key element of vulnerability, but also of institution building and governance. I was referring to that. That said, I really buy in all what you said about the need to, go for a revolution, also in the way we do science. But I was just referring to capacity.
I mean, capacity building has been studied, I know that. Right. But what I also see is that there is so much money invested by international organizations, by a lot of people, in capacity building aspect, with very little return, that it's time to rethink, how to better use the result of the studies that have been made by the social science community to apply it in a very different way. I think, I've been several times in Africa, South America, and talking to a number of scientists over there. They are in a situation where, although their country is facing with all these problems, they do not have the resources to address them. And we have to think how to address that in the future.
Maybe take one more question? Yeah.
So there are a couple things being raised there. Studying capacity is not the same as building it.
That's right.
And so there's another group to be involved here. But I think to take Michael's and Bill's point in a rich way, yes, the economics are quite critical, but as Bill could tell you better than anyone else probably in the room, we've shown that things like coordinated land use, we have a large return on investment over time, but our actions are not commensurate with knowing that. So your point about where the message comes from becomes very critical, but it links to the earlier set of study talks today, which says for technical assessments for like IPCC, the expectation in fact is too great. It's way more than a communications problem. It's actually about how we socialize lessons over time.
Right.
And so we shouldn't trivialize it. It's just, I'm trying to communicate to you what's in the information.
Last word.
Sorry.
I just wanted to ask you a question about globalization, which is a major trend I believe will affect this. In globalization, developing countries become more like developed countries, and developed countries become more like developing countries in the sense that they tend to stratify into rich and poor segments that depending on the technological knowledge of certain elites. Do you think that's going to have what impact do you think that will have, if any, on this understanding of our planet holistically as a physical social system?
Well, I like to answer maybe by an example. I mean, I'm in Germany a lot of the time, and Germany now felt that regarding, let's say, environmental aspect and climate, there was very little occurring in Africa, when in fact Africa is very much susceptible to effect of climate change, drought and extreme events and so on. And so Germany decided to put 100 million to build 2 large climate services, but they're more than climate. They are water, agriculture, biodiversity, climate, food services. One in West Africa, 10 countries involved, one in Southern Africa, where 6 or 7 countries involved. And so we go there and talk to these people and realize that essentially, if you go in the poorest country, the more they can do is measure temperature. They have no infrastructure to do anything. And so the way we're trying to address that is to put money. The German government puts money, but let the Africans develop their service with the help and the external help of German scientists and so on. And it seems to be working well because, for example, in one of those programs called WASCAL, they're going to organize 6 PhD schools where some Europeans and Americans could come and teach. So you will see those kind of things occurring in different parts of the world. But you need, in this globalization framework, to provide means, but to let the people locally play a big role and lead the effort. And that's a big challenge, of course, because they also need capacity building to know how to organize things. So I believe that there will be a more and more realization that, all these climate services that are flourishing all over the place, which will have to become, in fact, Earth system services, much broader than just the physical climate, will have to be done, but it needs to be done as part of an international global partnership. So just like the world becomes global, the science becomes global, the service needs to become under a partnership that is global. But much more I can not tell you at the moment.
Okay, well, the helicopter overhead signals that the cyclists are getting ready, and so we're going to take a break now. Let's give Guy another round of applause.